At issue tonight, the Carney era. Mark Carney is sworn in as the 24th Prime Minister and unveiled his smaller cabinet to respond to Donald Trump's trade war.
Canada's new government will be action-oriented, driven by a smaller but highly experienced team made to meet the moment we are in.
So what does Mark Carney's cabinet tell us about his priorities? What will they mean for Canada's response to Donald Trump? I'm Rosemary Barton here to break it down. The beginning of the Mark Carney era on At Issue tonight. Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, and Aaron Wary is in for Chantal Hébert. Good to see you all for a second night, and Aaron, to see you again. So a much smaller cabinet, as we predicted, sending some strong signals about things, and his first move today to get rid of the consumer carbon tax. Andrew, just give me your thoughts initially on what you saw in the cabinet in terms of the size and who he has tapped to fill some pretty important roles.
Well, it's a lot more stand pat than I think we were necessarily given to understand beforehand. The hype beforehand was it might be under 20 ministers. You heard rumors that there would be all sorts of star candidates unveiled, or maybe even a Conservative or a New Democrat. In the end, what you got is 24, which is certainly smaller than the bloated cabinet we had before. It takes us back to the early days of the Chrétien era, which is not exactly prehistory. And it's drawn, as the Conservatives were quick to point out, almost entirely from the existing cabinet. Only three new faces in the cabinet. I think only 3 or 4 who were dropped from the cabinet. But of course, you didn't have to do much in the way of change because so many ministers had already either resigned or signaled that they weren't running again. So to get down from 36 or 37 or whatever it was down to 24, it didn't take a lot of hacking and hewing. And so, yeah, you've got some of the main ministers who were handling some of these files to do with Donald Trump, particularly staying in their portfolios, probably appropriately. Probably this is not the time to be making major changes there. The only really significant, change in portfolios was Francois-Philippe Champagne taking over at finance, possibly predictably. In the end, what you get is maybe a slight tilt to a more centrist perception than the more left of center Trudeau cabinets, but much more stand pat and much more conventional than I think possibly some of us were hoping or some were fearing.
Very consolidated departments, though, and a lot of the language in terms of what those ministers' titles are does signal, I think, Althea, what Andrew's talking about, a move further into the center and away from some of the more progressive language that Justin Trudeau would have used. But give me your thoughts.
I guess on that front, there are a few indications that that's where he wanted to go, or at least was trying to position himself, but still kind of protecting the left flank. Yeah. I think the fact that Karina Gould, there's no room for her in this cabinet is noteworthy. But there are still progressives in that cabinet. Patty Hajdu, for example, is not a blue liberal at all. No. Neither is Nate Erskine-Smith. So they didn't Stephen make Guilbeault, room. Yeah, for Mr. Guilbeault, I think at some point, as the Conservative pointed out today, has once described himself as a socialist. So yes, there is room for people that are on the center left, even on the left, to be part of Mr. Carney's team. I think that the fact that he decided not to have a gender-balanced cabinet is perhaps a signal that he is different than Justin Trudeau, that he's not going to be consumed with identity issues. But caveat, he did include somebody who was never in cabinet, the chief whip. There's no reason why we need to have a chief whip in cabinet. Parliament is not even sitting. And he gave that job to the former small business minister. And had he not done that, we would not have 48% of women in the cabinet. We would have 43% of women in the cabinet. And so probably there would be more people who would be raising this as an issue. So I think in that way, they were little symbols. I also think maybe he kept too many of the old Justin Trudeau ministers. Yes, Dominic LeBlanc, Melanie Joly, that makes sense. But did you need to keep David McGuinty? Did you need to keep Stephen McKinnon? Did you need to keep Francois-Philippe? I mean, probably they would have been there anyways. But it just struck me as they made a conscious decision to keep people. And maybe, we never talk about this, but maybe that's a security-related thing. You can't vet people properly with the short time that they had. So I do wonder is this really a temporary cabinet and there will be a very different looking cabinet if the Liberals win in the next election? Maybe.
What message do you think he was trying to send with it, Aaron, in terms of message to Canadians about what kind of Prime Minister he is going to be?
I mean, I think the main message he wanted to convey was simply change. I think he used the word new about 12 times in his opening statement, even referred to Canada's new government, which sounds like a bit of a throwback to the Harper years, actually. I think, working with caucus or, working within caucus, if he wasn't going to go out and find unelected cabinet ministers, he could only do so much. I think, what he did, there were some fairly significant moves. Obviously Chrystia Freeland is back, but she's in, a relatively secondary role. Stephen Guilbeault is out at Environment. Mark Miller, Justin Trudeau's boyhood friend, is out of cabinet entirely. I think, though, that the larger idea of change, if he's going to represent that, is going to be more in sort of what goes on outside of his cabinet picks, right? I mean, I think just listening to him in a news conference, it's pretty apparent that we're not dealing with Justin Trudeau anymore. Noting that I don't believe there was any hugging going on today at the swearing in is a sign that we're not dealing with Justin Trudeau anymore. But I think this really is going to come back to the actions he takes now. Yeah. We saw a bit of that later in the afternoon, and I think that's more than what we get out of this cabinet. And I think Althea is right. There's a big question here of whether this is really the cabinet or whether this is the cabinet for now. It's going to be in the policy choices and the ideas that he brings forward.
Andrew, yeah.
I'm not even clear whether this is the cabinet for now, but there's other shoes to drop, surely. So there's no mention, for example, of women and gender equity. There's no mention of the regional development agencies. But unless I'm wrong,
that's inherited, and these are going back to industry and innovation.
Yeah, some of them are put inside departments, but go on, to your point.
Well, I just wonder whether at some point we're going to find there's going to be ministers of state that will be responsible for these things, either before the election or after the election, most likely after the election. Will this actually be the cabinet that's going to govern the country, or is this just to get them through the next couple of weeks?
Well, let's talk about the action, because that's the other word that he used a lot. We're action-oriented. We're focused on doing things. And he did sort of have a let's get down to business approach to today, I think, Althea. The fact that he did sign an order to get rid of the consumer carbon tax, keep the rebate in place at least for one more quarter, how significant is that in terms of signaling a break with Justin Trudeau?
Well, this day was all about imagery. I mean, it's not really that much about substance. And the image that came out was what he called an experience instead of an old cabinet, an experienced cabinet, and a day where he got things done. It's a lean cabinet that is action-oriented, and so he needed to show something, I think. Yeah. So what he did is really just, through regulation, bring down the price to zero. So the carbon tax basically doesn't exist. But eventually, if the Liberals are reelected, they will have to change the law, repeal the law, so they don't open themselves up to lawsuits. Yeah. But it does effectively get rid of the carbon tax. And he ran on that. So you can say, promise made, promise delivered. He takes away the largest baton that Pierre Poilievre has been using for the last 2 years, clobbering Justin Trudeau on the head with. And even ministers that, were not super keen with this idea of getting rid of the consumer price, everybody was suggesting that, they basically had lost the war and they needed to move on, and they would try to find other ways of making their emission targets.
Yeah, Aaron, on that point?
Yeah, I think if you go back to 2015, the first act of the Trudeau government was at least symbolically announcing that they were bringing back the long-form census.
That's right.
Feels like a long time ago now. Yeah. But that, I think, is sort of a comparison point for this. It's a sort of big gesture right off the bat to say this is not the previous government. It does raise questions for the Liberals, for the other parties as well, about what you're going to do instead. But it may be, we can talk about the demise of the carbon tax forever, but it may be at this point had to go so that there could be a real debate about climate policy in this country and get back to or get to some kind of conversation about what exactly these parties are going to do in terms of emissions rather than whether or not they were for or against the carbon tax.
Just 30 seconds to you, Andrew, on that.
Well, the sad and bizarre part is it's not as if people are not, unless we don't have any carbon policy at all, there's going to be a carbon policy. It will cost things and it will cost consumers. Only there won't be a rebate anymore. So the idea that we're actually going to be letting people out of some sort of hardship as a result of this is completely bogus. It's going to mean we're going to have a more expensive, less efficient system without rebates that ultimately the cost will get passed on to consumers. They just won't know it. And that is basically what the compromise, the agreement that's been made amongst all the parties now is, let's just keep the public in the dark.
At issue, new dynamic. With a new Prime Minister and a new cabinet, opposition leaders are previewing their attacks for the Carney Liberals.
A Mark Carney government is a race to the right between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre.
Today, Liberals are trying to trick Canadians into electing them for a fourth term in power with a cabinet that is 87% the same as Trudeau's cabinet.
So how are opposition parties realigning and preparing for an election with Mark Carney at the helm of the Liberals? Let's bring everybody back. Andrew, Althea, and Aaron. Althea, I'll start with you here. What did you make of the response and the attempt to, I mean, they've obviously been preparing for this, but now here they are faced with Mark Carney as Prime Minister and this cabinet. What did you make of the response?
Unimpressive. I'm actually quite surprised that they didn't try harder to find more wedge issues. So the two main messages we heard from Jagmeet Singh was on Karina Gould being left out and basically suggesting that there's no space for progressives in Mr. Carney's cabinet. We will see whether the policies match the action, but I think he can point to other people, as I mentioned before, in his cabinet to say, no, there is room for them. And then quibbling over the title of Steve McKinnon's new combined portfolio, which was Labour and Employment, and now is called Jobs and Families. The fact that Labour is no longer there, Mr. Singh was arguing that this says that there's no room for unions and there's no room for the workers. We're just talking about jobs. I don't know if Canadians are really going to see it that way. And for Mr. Poilievre, he was talking about how for the first time, he used the word the rebate. We heard him talk about the carbon pricing rebate. I don't know if it's the very first time, it's the first time I've noticed it. And then there won't be a rebate? What? This rebate that you seem to forget existed for the last, 6 years? Suddenly you're going to miss it? And he also talked about this being a law and that Mr. Carney could not do this without repealing the law. Well, actually, he could. So it's like you're kind of misleading the public. It's you're holding on to the old arguments. It's time to move on. Like they're not running against Justin Trudeau anymore. The landscape has changed. They're the old. They're the tired and old, and he's the brand new shiny thing, and they need to find a better line of attack. And I do not think that either party have landed on something that works.
Yeah, I have to say, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Althea, Aaron. I was struck by how much it just sounded the same, that there's no new line of attack, because certainly there are weaknesses to go after here, but they don't seem to have seized on them or settled on them yet, at any rate.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jagmeet Singh went for the easy ones on day one to say, there's no minister of gender equality here, there's no minister of youth, there's no minister of diversity. Those charges could amount to something if the Liberal platform seems short in those areas, but otherwise it's sort of a branding exercise. And I think the Carney response will simply be, as it kind of was today, I'm about actions, not words. And that, is a play, of course, on what was the major complaint about Justin Trudeau, that he could throw these words around, but that the government didn't live up to them. For the Conservatives, they still feel like they're in a spot where they're kind of just throwing stuff against the wall to see what works. And they haven't quite figured out how to deal with Mark Carney. The argument that he is sort of more of the same, there's something to that Mark Carney can't come in and say, the last 9.5 years didn't happen, or, I don't have to account for them. He can't completely separate himself from those things. But the idea that Mark Carney and Justin Trudeau are the same person, I just don't know that voters are going to accept that. They can make the argument that he's the economic advisor, and yes, he was providing advice, but they're just very clearly different people. And, depending on what kind of platform we see from the Liberal Party in the next election, which may be very soon, it should be, I think, or could be very clear that we're dealing with a kind of very different offer at this point.
Yeah. Andrew, what did you make of how they responded?
Well, they did seem to be a bit flummoxed, I think partly because it, in the end, was a fairly cautious cabinet change. The best thing Jagmeet Singh could come up with was you called it jobs instead of labor. Yves Blanchet said the problem was there wasn't enough ministers from the Quebec City area, which is not the strongest complaint you can make about a cabinet. And while Pierre Poilievre had the strongest point of saying, this is mostly just the same Liberal cabinet, so where's the big change here? That got lost a lot. He started wandering into all kinds of, as Aaron said, throwing everything he could think of to stick. So in answer to a question from a Rebel News representative, he seemed to suggest maybe there was something suspicious in the election of Mr. Carney, he claimed without evidence that he might be working against the interests of Canada because he had such brutal, quote unquote, conflicts of interest. There was just a lot of loose talk, frankly, being thrown around that I don't think is really advancing his case, particularly if we're into a contest of leaders and who can show mature judgment and leadership in a time of crisis. He still seems in the mode of let's tear down as much as we can the opponent rather than trying to build himself up as a prime minister in waiting.
Yeah, go ahead, Althea. Yeah.
That's about feeding like the conspiracy theories on social media so that they can run off with a theory that Mark Carney was elected in a completely undemocratic way, which is actually the way things are done in this country. And it is normal in the circumstance that the prime minister has not been elected by everybody. And he will face the electorate, but they're feeding that. And you see that echoed by Conservative MPs, amplifying that message, retweeting that message. And so I think that he is doing that to feed other people to run with that on the internet.
Sure.
But it's one step beyond that, which is the thing he's got himself into talking about was only 150,000 of the 400,000 registered Liberal members voted. There must be something suspicious about that. Now, he prefaced that by saying it may just be that there's a lack of enthusiasm, which would be a more traditional and tenable attack you could make on your opponent. But to even go near there of saying, well, there was something suspicious about that, I don't think showed great judgment.
Yeah, to invent something or infer something, as you point out, has no evidence to back it up at all. Last point to you, Althea, on what that tells you about where Pierre Poilievre is at in terms of understanding how to take on Carney.
I think both the NDP and the Conservatives believe that Mr. Carney's personal wealth and success can be portrayed as a handicap. Yeah. For the NDP, he doesn't know how regular people live, and he's not in it for you. He's really out there to protect CEOs and other multimillionaires. And for Mr. Poilievre, it is about the conflicts of interest and, did he act against Canada's interest? And why isn't his stuff in a blind trust? And today he, very publicly said, actually, my stuff is already in a blind trust, 6 months ahead of time. I have put it away. But, he would not divulge what his assets are worth. I'm not sure that Pierre Poilievre has divulged how much his assets are worth. I should say that. I don't know. But, so I don't know that we want to get into that context.
No.
I will say that I thought the most critical thing was actually said from Francois-Philippe, the new finance minister, where he talked about this was a brand new era, a new era of financial sustainability. And then at the same time, in the same sentence, he said, and now we're going to invest more. We're going to invest everywhere. You can't do both things, really. So I feel like this is an area of vulnerability that also sounds a lot like Justin Trudeau 2015. And so they themselves don't seem to have settled on a message beyond Canada Strong that they're going to bring to the electorate at the moment.
I'm Rosemary Barton. Thank you so much for watching a special edition of At Issue.